Imagine this for a second. It's 1908. There are no highways, no GPS, no gas stations, and your car has wooden wheels and no heater. Now imagine deciding to drive that car from New York to Paris. And I don't mean taking a boat across the Atlantic. I mean driving west. These guys actually planned to drive across the frozen ocean and through the bandit-filled wastelands of Siberia. It sounds absolutely insane, right? Well, it actually happened. Today, I'm going to tell you the true story of the Great Auto Race of 1908, the deadliest, weirdest, and most impossible road trip in human history. But before we jump into the madness, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button if you enjoy history's crazy side, and smash subscribe so you don't miss our next story. And I have a question for you guys. Drop a comment below. What is the longest road trip you have ever taken? Let me know. All right, buckle up. Let's head to the starting line. Part 1. The Mud, the Ice, and the Impossible Dream. Chapter 1. The Frozen Canyon of Broadway. February 12, 1908, New York City. The city was not just cold, it was frozen solid. A biting wind whipped off the Hudson River, cutting through the heavy wool coats of the spectators. But the cold did not matter. Nothing mattered, except the spectacle unfolding at Times Square. A crowd of 250,000 people had gathered. They spilled off the sidewalks, hung from telegraph poles, and leaned perilously out of office windows. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts, coal smoke, and the raw, acrid scent of unrefined gasoline. They were screaming, waving flags, and pushing against the police barricades. They were there to witness madness. In the center of the square, 6 machines sat idling. To a modern eye, they would look like farm equipment. They had open cockpits, exposing the drivers to the elements. They had wooden artillery wheels. There were no seat belts, no heaters, no GPS, and barely any suspension. These 6 metal beasts were about to attempt the impossible, a race from New York to Paris, not by boat, but by road, westward, across the wild, unmapped United States, up through the frozen hell of Alaska, across the Bering Strait, and through the desolate wastelands of Siberia. At the head of the pack sat the American Hope, the Thomas Flyer. It was a gray, bruising monster of a car, 4 cylinders, 60 horsepower. It looked less like a race car and more like a locomotive that had jumped the tracks. Behind the wheel sat George Schuster, a man who didn't smile much. Schuster was a mechanic's mechanic. He could fix anything with a wrench and a curse word. He checked his gauges. The engine thrummed, a low, powerful heartbeat. Next to him was the German entry, the Protoss. It was a marvel of military engineering, commanded by Lieutenant Hans Koppen. Koppen sat stiffly in his pristine uniform, looking at the chaotic American crowd with a mix of disdain and determination. His car was loaded with wine, champagne, and enough spare parts to build a second car. He wasn't here to race. He was here to conquer. Then there were the French, the Dion Bouton, the Motobloc, and the tiny César Nodine, and the spirited Italian Zust. At 11:15 a.m., a gold-plated pistol fired into the gray sky. The roar was deafening. The crowd surged forward. The cars lurched into motion, their chains rattling, smoke billowing. The great race had begun. They drove north out of the city, cheered on by millions. But as the skyline of Manhattan faded behind them, the cheering stopped. The road ended, and the nightmare began. Chapter 2. The White Hell. The experts had said it couldn't be done. Within 24 hours, it looked like the experts were right. In 1908, there were no highways. Once the cars left the cobblestones of New York, they entered a world of dirt paths meant for horses, not automobiles. And in that winter, the snow was historic. By the time the Thomas Flyer reached the Hudson Valley, the snow was 2 feet deep. George Schuster wasn't driving, he was plowing. The American crew realized quickly that speed was irrelevant. This was a siege. "Dig!" he yelled over the wind. The crew jumped out with shovels. For every mile they drove, they spent an hour digging. The cold was excruciating. They wrapped themselves in furs, but the wind found every gap. The French César-Naudin, the smallest car, died within miles. Its axle snapped, unable to handle the American winter. 1 down, 5 to go. As they pushed into Indiana, the snow turned into a trap. The roads were buried so deep they ceased to exist. Schuster, desperate to keep moving, looked at the only thing that was plowed, the railroad tracks. "Get her up on the ties," he ordered. It was a bone-jarring, teeth-rattling decision. The Thomas Flyer bounced along the wooden railroad ties, thump, 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 for miles. The vibration was so intense, it loosened the bolts on the chassis. The tires, made of primitive rubber, were shredded.
Chapter 5. The Empire of Mud. May 1908. Vladivostok, Russia. The Thomas Flyer rolled off the ship onto Russian soil, and George Schuster looked at the map. He saw 8,000 miles of nothing. The race had turned into a bitter duel. The French were gone. The Italian Zust was days behind. It was now America versus Germany. The Thomas Flyer versus the Protos. Lieutenant Kopin and the German team had a head start. They had arrived in Vladivostok first and immediately set off into the interior. But set off is a generous term. The spring thaw in Siberia had turned the landscape into a nightmare that made the American Midwest look like a paved highway. There were no roads in Siberia. There were only post roads, ancient trails used by horse carts that had been churned into waist-deep swamps. Schuster made a terrifying decision. He looked at the Trans-Siberian Railway tracks, stretching into the infinite horizon. "We take the tracks," he said. For the second time in the race, the car became a train. But unlike in America, the Russian tracks were wider, a different gauge, and the wooden ties were spaced unevenly. The Thomas Flyer bounced violently. Bang, 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 mile after agonizing mile. And there was another problem. The trains were still running. Schuster had to keep one eye on the ties and one eye on the rearview mirror. When they saw smoke on the horizon or heard the whistle of a locomotive, they had seconds to scramble. They would have to drive the car off the steep embankment, crashing into the bushes to let the train pass, and then spend an hour winching the heavy machine back up onto the tracks. Chapter 6. Running on Spirits. As they pushed deeper into Manchuria and Siberia, a new enemy emerged: fuel. Gas stations were non-existent. Schuster had arranged for fuel drops at train stations, but often the fuel wasn't there, or it was the wrong kind. The Thomas Flyer was a thirsty beast. In the middle of the desolate taiga, the engine sputtered. They were out of gas. Schuster walked to a nearby village. It was a tiny settlement of log cabins. He didn't speak Russian. The villagers didn't speak English. Using hand gestures, he explained he needed fuel. The villagers brought him vodka. Schuster shook his head. He needed kerosene or refined spirits. Eventually, he found a merchant selling high-grade spirits and kerosene for lamps. He bought it all. He mixed the concoction in the tank. The engine coughed, backfired, and blew black smoke, but it ran. The Americans were running on a cocktail of lamp oil and determination. Meanwhile, the Germans were suffering too. The Protos was a heavy, military machine, and it kept sinking in the swamps. But Lieutenant Kopin was relentless. He paid Russian peasants to dig the car out. He barely slept. He was driven by national pride. He could not let the Americans beat the Kaiser's team. Chapter 7. The Gear and the Blacksmith. Deep in the Ural Mountains, disaster struck the Americans. A sickening crack echoed from beneath the Thomas Flyer. The car ground to a halt. Schuster crawled underneath in the mud. His heart sank. The transmission gear, a massive chunk of hardened steel responsible for driving the wheels, had sheared off. It was destroyed. They were thousands of miles from a factory. They had no spare transmission gears. This should have been the end of the race. The Germans were hundreds of miles ahead. Schuster didn't quit. He pulled the broken gear out of the car and hitched a ride on a horse cart to the nearest town. He found a blacksmith shop, a dark, sooty room with a coal forge, and a bearded Russian smith who had never seen a car part in his life. Schuster put the broken pieces on the anvil. He found a block of raw steel. For the next 3 days, the American mechanic and the Russian blacksmith worked in a frenzy. They heated the steel until it glowed white-hot. Schuster hammered it, shaping the teeth of the gear by eye. He tempered it in oil. It was crude, it was ugly, but when Schuster installed it back into the Thomas Flyer and cranked the engine, the car moved. He had hand-forged a transmission gear in the middle of Siberia. They were back in the hunt.
Chapter 8. The Ghost of the Protos. As they crossed the Urals and entered European Russia, the roads improved. The Thomas Flyer could finally open up its throttle. They were doing 40, sometimes 50 miles per hour. They were chasing a ghost. Everywhere they stopped, the villagers told them, "A German car? It passed through 4 days ago." Then at the next town, 3 days ago. Schuster drove like a madman. He stopped sleeping. He drove for 20 hours at a stretch, hallucinating from fatigue. The crew had to slap him to keep him awake. They looked like monsters, covered in layers of oil, soot, and mud, their eyes wild and red. They crossed into Germany. The reception was hostile. The German crowds jeered the American car, throwing rocks and insults. They wanted their Protos to win. They crossed into France. The reception changed. The French cheered. "Vive les Américains!" But the news came over the telegraph wire. The Germans had reached Paris. On July 26, 1908, Lieutenant Koppen drove the Protos down the boulevards of Paris. He was greeted as the victor. He sipped champagne at the finish line. The Germans celebrated. They believed they had won. Chapter 9. The Last Mile. 4 days later, July 30th, 1908. The Thomas Flyer crossed the French countryside. They knew the Germans were already in Paris. The crew was demoralized, but Schuster knew the math. Remember the penalty. The Germans had skipped part of the U.S. by train, 15-day penalty. The Americans had wasted time going to Alaska, a 15-day allowance. The Americans didn't need to beat the Germans physically. They just needed to finish within 30 days of them. It was evening when they reached the outskirts of Paris. The city of lights was glowing. Suddenly, a whistle blew. A French gendarme, policeman, stepped into the road and held up his hand. Schuster slammed on the brakes. "What is it?" "Monsieur," the policeman said, pointing to the front of the battered car, "you have no headlamp. It is illegal to drive in Paris at night without a light." Schuster stared at him. "We just drove 22,000 miles around the world. We fought wolves in Siberia. We drove across the ocean. And you're stopping us for a busted headlight?" The policeman shrugged. "The law is the law." Schuster wanted to scream, but a miracle happened. A passing French bicyclist saw the commotion. He recognized the famous American car. Without a word, he lifted his bicycle off the road and placed it on the hood of the Thomas Flyer. "Use my light," the cyclist shouted. With a bicycle strapped to the hood, its tiny lantern flickering in the dark, the Thomas Flyer roared down the Champs-Élysées. Chapter 10. The Verdict. They pulled up in front of the office of Le Matin newspaper. The crowd was massive. They dragged Schuster out of the car. He could barely stand. He hadn't bathed in weeks. He weighed 20 pounds less than when he started. The race officials sat down to do the final calculations. Physical arrival, the German Protos arrived 4 days before the Americans. The math, the Germans were penalized 15 days. The Americans were credited 15 days. That meant the Americans had a 26-day advantage in the final tally. The announcement was made. The winner of the New York to Paris race is the Thomas Flyer of the United States of America. The Germans were furious, but the logic held. They had used a train. The Americans had driven every inch of the route that was physically possible. Epilogue: The Survivor. George Schuster returned to America as a hero, but he was a humble man. He went back to work at the Thomas factory. He didn't race for glory. He raced because it was his job. The Thomas Flyer became a legend, but legends fade. Over the decades, the car was sold, resold, and eventually abandoned in a scrapyard. It was nearly crushed for metal. Years later, automobile enthusiast William Harrah found the wreck. He realized what it was. He bought it and lovingly restored it to its 1908 glory, not shiny and new, but rugged and ready. Today, if you go to the National Automobile Museum in Reno, Nevada, you will see it. It's big, it's gray, and it looks tough as nails. It is the car that drove the world. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghost of George Schuster cursing the Siberian mud. This concludes the Impossible Drive.